I thought about starting today's episode speaking a little French to you, but here's the thing. I have a lot of French friends and they are classy, and we're going to talk about some of them today, and I'm not sure me speaking French is the classiest way to start. So I'm going to go ahead and pour myself a little bit of the finest sparkling apple grape juice that I know how to find at the local grocery store, and we're going to class it up around here and talk about France. Even though it's only our third episode of Flute Tube, you may have noticed already that I'm a Francophile. That is true. But here's the thing, every flutist has to be to some extent. Every flute player has to have something French in their blood, whether they know it or not, and that's what we're going to talk about today. What's the deal with France and flute playing? There are so many things, there's so much history, and it's impossible to pin it all down. But I'm going to try to pare it way back and talk fast so that we can cover as much ground as possible. Paris has been the center for flute for as long as the flute has been around. But even before anything like the modern flute existed, Paris was a very important center for music because of the Notre Dame Cathedral. So whenever I've gone into the Notre Dame Cathedral, I've felt emotional because I know that I'm standing on the ground that was really the birthplace of our Western music tradition. But as far as the flute specifically goes, there was a family much later that developed the one-keyed flute and also the oboe. This was the Hauditaire family, and it's because of the Hauditaires that France has the longest modern woodwind instrument history of any country. But to get back to Paris, another reason the flute became so important was the Paris Conservatory. It has such a long history, but I'm going to give you a mini history lesson about it. A driving reason behind why the Paris Conservatory was established was the French Revolution. They wanted to move music education from where it had traditionally happened at churches like Notre Dame to become the responsibility of the state. So they established the Paris Conservatory in 1795. Although Napoleon cut some staff and funding at the conservatory in 1802 to conserve some funds. There's always politics in everything, even music! And then when the Böhm system flute came along in the 1830s, there were a handful of prominent Parisian flute players who instantly adopted it in the 1830s. There was also a committee put together in Paris to examine the 1832 Böhm system flute, and this committee instantly went to the Paris Conservatory in 1832 and said, "We believe that you should adopt this instrument for your conservatory." Acceptance of the Böhm system flute was much slower in Germany, where Böhm came from, and also everywhere else in the world. For instance, there was an 1881 audition held in Leipzig at the Gewandhaus, and a requirement if you wanted to come audition was that you not play a Böhm system flute. The Paris Conservatory was a tiny bit slower to officially adopt the Böhm system flute than Parisian professional flute players at the time, and here's why. Toulouse was the flute professor at the Paris Conservatory from 1829 to 1859, and he ran his own flute manufacturing company, and that company was the official supplier of flutes to the Paris Conservatory. So Toulouse required his students to use his own flute. Still, you can't blame Toulouse for this clearly political choice entirely, because the Böhm system flute was not standardized yet. Still, here's your proof of politics. Toulouse retired in 1859, and in 1860, the Paris Conservatory officially adopted that 1847 silver Böhm system flute. Louis Lot became the official provider of flutes to the Paris Conservatory. So all the conservatory students got these nice, uniform, great instruments from the Louis Lot Flute Company. In 1860, a brilliant young flutist at the Paris Conservatory named Taffanel decided to apply for the Premier Prix. 1860, the same year that the Böhm system flute was officially adopted by the Paris Conservatory, Taffanel became the first flutist to win the first prize playing a Böhm system flute. There had been some other flute students who tried to do that in the late 1830s, but Toulouse shot them down. Receiving that first prize from the Paris Conservatory was like receiving a degree with honors for Taffanel, and after that he became very professionally busy in the Paris music scene. He performed all over Paris, and it was later in 1894 that he himself became the new flute professor at the Paris Conservatory. There's something else very musically significant that happened in Paris in the same year, 1894. Does anyone know what it is? Anyone? Anyone? I'm pretty sure I'm alone in here, I'll just have to tell you. It was the premiere of Debussy's Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun. So if you think about that musical context, that might tell you a lot about Taffanel's approach to sound and color. For flute players who may be interested in this detail, the flute soloist at that premiere was Georges Barrère. And there's so much more I could say about Debussy and French music in the first half of the 20th century. Focus on my topic. Okay, I'm ready to go forward. With this perfect set of circumstances and also his own talent on the flute, Taffanel became the father of the modern French school of flute playing. How he intersected with the Böhm system flute contributed enormously to that. The new material of silver, the new mechanism, greatly influenced the way that he developed his tone and his vibrato and his sense of pitch. He and flute players of his generation were almost starting from scratch in a lot of ways because the instrument was so different. And his students took his lead with this new metal flute and his beautiful sound and his great technique, and they went on to win principal positions in orchestras all over the world. In the United States, that included Boston and Philadelphia and New York in the group that was going to become the New York Philharmonic. All of these students of his were big stars, but his biggest star was a student that he groomed from childhood, and that was Philippe Gaubert. Taffanel fostered Gaubert, his tone, his musicality, all aspects of his musicianship and technique from the time that he was a child and a musical child prodigy. From Taffanel and his star student Gaubert, we have this book that's known all over the world as the Flute Player's Bible. Taffanel started to try to complete method in 1908, but he died that same year, so Gaubert came along and finished it and published this 17 big daily exercises taken out of that method. Very quickly, it was published in many different languages. You can still see this version. It's in 5 different languages because it was used all over the world and still is. Of course, this is my ancient copy. I got this 34 years ago. But you can see our cute grandpa Taffanel in the front here and the very distinguished looking Mr. Gaubert at the back. You should know this whole book, all 17 exercises inside out. The next big heir of the French Flute School was Marcel Moyse. Marcel Moyse was a student of Taffanel early in his life, and then he became a student of Gaubert later on. He taught at the Paris Conservatory along with Gaubert first. He was Gaubert's teaching assistant and he taught technique classes, and then after Gaubert retired, he became the full-time professor of flute at the Paris Conservatory. This gives us a trail of wonderful teachers, amazing flute players, Taffanel to Gaubert to Moyse. And for me, continuing that into the present, Moyse taught a lot of students, including Michel Debost and Carol Wincenz, my 2 major teachers that I studied with at Oberlin and Juilliard. There used to be a bit of a rivalry, at least in the United States, between the French School of Flute Playing and the American School of Flute Playing. The American School of Flute Playing said that their father of American flute playing was William Kincaid, and then the heir of Kincaid was Julius Baker. Well, that's great. But who did Kincaid study with? Georges Barrère. And who do you think Barrère studied with? Any guesses? Taffanel. So this to me means that, sorry, but the American School of Flute Playing really was kind of another branch of the French School of Flute Playing. And I can get away with saying this because depending on how you draw my genealogy, I also go straight back through the American line of players. To this day, a lot of the most world famous players are still coming out of the Paris Conservatory. First, there was Jean-Pierre Rampal, who really made flute something that you could be star famous at. And then there was James Galway. Oh, he's Irish, but wait, he studied at the Paris Conservatory. Same thing with Pahud. He's Swiss, but he studied at the Paris Conservatory. So somehow the Paris Conservatory just keeps churning out these amazing world-class players. Another thing the Paris Conservatory has done for the flute, which is so important, is that with the first prize, which they awarded for so many years, rather than giving a degree or that kind of thing, they always had to have a new piece written for that prize. And that's left us with so much great French flute music. We've talked a lot about the Paris Conservatory, and it's true that it is the biggest reason to think of France as being the flute center of the universe. But there are also other reasons. One of them actually is just the French language itself. It's placed very far forward in your face, into the mask of your face, in a very resonant spot. Also, you know, French culture is just flute friendly. They care a lot about color and subtlety and beauty. Debost used to say that in Paris, they have a different kind of cheese to eat for every day of the year. He also liked to talk about chain restaurants and other chain things that Americans like to do all the time, and how anti-French that is, because he would say that each restaurant on every street corner of France should have its own unique character and flavors. Like his flute ancestors, Michel Debost had a lot of technique and tone studies that he would make us do, and one of my favorite is his scale game. And he talks about how carefully you should listen to your sound and make a beautiful sound. He says, listen to and love your tone. Taste every note like you are tasting very fine apple grape juice, or it was something like that. I don't remember exactly what it was, but anyway, santé! Oh, I have flute majors who should totally know what that means. If you know what I just said, put it in the comments. Now we have what's known as the International School of Flute Playing. There are great players and great ideas all over the world, but nobody can deny, and I don't think anyone would want to deny, that really we all have our flute playing roots firmly planted in French soil. So first of all, de la sonorité, the study of sound, all about sound. I got this book in 5th grade. I'd been playing the flute for a year. I was so insulted when I opened it. I was like, doesn't my teacher know I can play stuff that's harder than this? If you know how to use it correctly, this is really important. It can revolutionize your sound. Another one by Moyse. This is like a more advanced tone study book. 24 little melodic studies. They're very short and simple, and again, you might think they were written for beginner flute players, but they're really so that you can apply tone to little melodic ideas. And I like this book especially because Debost gave me some of Moyse notes that Moyse gave to Debost. So like here it says, play all 16ths like you're saying strawberry, strawberry, don't double dot. So if you're one of my students and you want to see those Moyse notes sometime, I can show you. This is yet another step in that direction, 25 little melodic etudes. And again, they're getting a little harder, but the idea is how you're going to apply your sound to these slightly more advanced studies and keep a homogeneous, beautiful sound through the whole thing. Another one, this was published and revised by Moyse, but the exercises are actually by Fürstenau. They are a lot harder. 24 exercises, caprices, and preludes in all major and minor keys. So you can think about how your flute reacts in the different keys, what the intonation is like, what the tone qualities are like, and what you're trying to get out of your flute. This one is called How I Stayed in Shape. That's what the English version is translated to be. And I really like this one because again, they published it in Moyse's handwriting. So you can see his old handwriting, and then it just shows a lot of melodies that he would play to stay in shape as a flute player. There's a Beethoven quartet, there's a Toulouse grand solo, there's an excerpt from Mozart's Magic Flute. You know, he was the flute player in the Paris Opéra, just like Taffanel and Gaubert had been, and he had a cellist uncle who was very important to his musical development. And along those same lines, tone development through interpretation. This is one of my favorites. This is a collection of melodies that Moyse put together, mostly from operas, but also from other repertoire, from other instruments. There's a little bit of flute music in here too. But it's applying your sound to these beautiful melodies. This is not by a French guy. This is by Paul Edmund-Davies, the 28-day warm-up book for all flautists, ... eventually. And that is true because this is a hard book. It's divided into sections that are really useful, but a lot of the finger exercises are taken straight from TNG, 17 big daily exercises, and then they're made much more difficult